difference, and inference of difference predates issues around race, although they are linked in that historically our problems are often as human beings is that we are very tribal. It's interesting how we often use that as a pejorative to point at Africa, but actually all of us, in its simplistic sense, we exist within particular communities, particular sets of ideas that are often shaped around notions of sameness. And therefore, when we other people, when we imagine people are different from us in some kind of either biological way or in terms of difference of ethnicity and culture, those are usually like the seeds that then lead to sort of systemic racism. So what we're going to do this evening is first I'm going to tell you a couple of stories just to show two contrasting ways in which race operates within the body politic, but particularly within the UK in the first instance, but actually around the globe, particularly in terms of the global north. So in theory, that'll take about 15, 20 minutes. Then I've got an exercise for us to do. Now, here's the good news. Let me tell you this up front. In the exercise, you cannot be wrong. So let me just say that now, so actually just to take away any particular fears that you might have that somehow in the exercise, if you give a wrong answer, you will out yourself as an absolute disgusting fascist. And clearly, therefore, like we will need to banish you from this evening and throw holy water on you and try to exorcise the devil and the demon from your body. Now, all those things may well be true, but that will not be because of the exercise. That's because, actually, some of you actually may well be downright awful fascists. I mean, I'm joking. I'm sure you're not. However, just to say that the exercise, there are not right and wrong answers, that as we will see when we do it, each response in and of itself has theological weight to it. But as we often know about when we're thinking about what it means to be human and what it means to follow Jesus Christ in order to be disciples, there's no one simplistic answer that answers every single context and every single situation and every single incident that arises. So really what I'm trying to do this evening is not to give you simplistic answers, it's to give you tools. It's to give you tools that can then help you to say, in this particular situation, what are the options I have? As we do church, however we configure what church is, as we face these different situations, what tools do we have? What options do we have? Because we always have options. There are always things that we can do. So that's what I'm trying to do. And so really what I'm trying to do is to problematize this notion of sameness and difference. Sameness and difference, because what I want to suggest is that at various points within the life of the church, in terms of how we've tried to wrestle with issues of difference, or wrestle with different ways of configuring what it means to be human, we tend to fall back on either one of these two opposing ways. Either we try to assume a sense of all of us being same, and there's a lot of theological truth in that in terms of being same, and we'll explore what that means. But other times we do the opposite and say, well, actually, like we're not all the same, like we're all different, and what we need to do is to emphasize our differences and affirm the different perspectives we bring, and that's another way of trying to get at being anti-racist. Both, as I say, have a strong element to them, but neither is perfect, and both set up as many problems as they solve. So as I said, nothing you can say this evening will be absolutely wrong. There'll be a measure of truth in all of it. It's just that no one will say anything that's absolutely true.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, sorry. Oh.
Okay. So, two stories, both stories from my own life, both at different points of my life. So the first one, and apologies for those who have heard me say this before, because it's just one of those stories that has really been formative to my experience. So it's my first day at school. So this is September 1969, and I'm 4 years old. And so my mother takes me, I'm the eldest of 4 children. I should have said that. So I'm the eldest of 4 children. My parents were the wondrous generation. So they came from the island of Jamaica in 1957, and they came as British subjects. So they came with the blue passports, those things that we are yearning to take back through Brexit, although made in France. But okay, let's skip over that. So they came as British subjects because the island of Jamaica had been a crown colony in the British Empire from 1694 right through to 1962. So when they came in 1957, Jamaica was not yet independent. And they came at the invitation of the British state. Ironically, in the Conservative government in the 1950s, when the invite came, it was made by the then Minister of Trade, that was Enoch Powell. Look at the irony of that. So anyway, so they come 1957. I'm their first child. I'm born 1964. I start school in 1969. And so my mum brings me to the gates of Usher Street Primary School in Bradford, West Yorkshire. I'm from God's own city, Bradford, in Yorkshire. And the reception teacher comes out and she collects me, and they bring me into the school courtyard. And what I remember is there were about 20 new children starting. I was the only black child, or as they said in those days, like the coloured child. So I'm there with a group of about 20 other children. And that's the moment I knew I was black. And the reason I knew I was black, because up to that point, growing up in my family, I was normal. I never thought about being black. I was just with my parents. I was the eldest. My brother is 3 years younger than me. So when I started school, he would have probably just been born. And I was spoiled, eldest child, and all that. Suddenly I go to school and I'm in this line. And not only do I discover I'm black, I also discover I'm a problem. Because as I'm stood there in my short pants, why you let little kids wear short pants in Yorkshire in winter, who knows, but still, there I am in my short pants, freezing my ass off. And the form teacher, the reception teacher, and the head teacher are in conversation. It's obviously about me, because they keep looking at me and gesticulating, and then going back to the huddle and having a conversation. So I know they're talking about me, because they're not looking at any other kids, they're just looking at me. And I still remember, okay, some of this is revisionist, and some of it is probably me now, in light of being an academic and an educator, probably overlay with all kind of things I probably never thought of at the time. Let me just be clear about that. But I think I remember being in that line and thinking to myself, this is really odd, in that they're talking about me, but they're not talking to me. After what seemed like a long delay, probably wasn't really that long, all the white kids go off in one direction, and the reception teacher says, Anthony, you come with me. Now, the thing is, I'm the eldest child, and so no one in my family who come from Jamaica has ever been to a British school before. So, of course, as far as I'm concerned, everything they tell me, I don't know if it's not normal or not, I just assume it's normal. So all the white kids go off in one direction, I go off in the other direction. And they take me to what I now know was called an immigration centre. And so immigration centres were set up in Britain on the back of the 1966 Local Government Act that set up this section called Section 11. And Section 11 gave special provision for local authorities who were the recipients of significant numbers of children from the new Commonwealth. And by new Commonwealth, I mean those countries that were part of the British Empire, populated by black and brown people. The old Commonwealth were the white settler communities. And so they were New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, well, Southern Africa, so South Africa and Rhodesia. And then if you go then further west to Canada. So those were the old Commonwealth, like the white settler communities. And Britain has always had a different relationship with the white settler communities than it did with what's called the new Commonwealth, which is the bits that they colonized full of people of African and Asian descent. So my parents were part of the new Commonwealth. So when people of the new Commonwealth began to come into Britain in post-Second World War, part of the Windrush, And we began to settle. My parents' generation settled in large cities because they were largely brought to do industrial work and to work in factories and to work in public transport. Those areas where we settled, not necessarily out of choice. Some of you may have heard that whole language of no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. So therefore, part of the end up living in a ghetto is not out of a choice. It's because that's the only place where black people actually could get places to rent, usually in flea-bitten places that like the rent was exorbitant. So a lot of people settled in Bradford, and therefore what local governments were given is resources to set up places to try and socialise these foreign children into a British way of life. Anyway, so they took me to an immigration centre. And even to this day, I still say it's the only time I've ever been a genius, because in the 3 days I was there, it was a piece of cake, because they largely asked me questions to which I knew the answers already. So it's something like, so Anthony, can you spell your name? Okay, Anthony. If that's the measure of this education stuff, then it's a piece of cake. Because, like I said, they ask me questions of things like, it's like, do you know where you are? I'm in Bradford. And where is Bradford? It's in Yorkshire. It's in England. Third day, after the third day, at the end of the third day, I'm let out. All of us are going out. Now, I should have said, I was the only Caribbean person in that cohort. The rest were young children who had come from South Asia, particularly Pakistan and India. Third day, I go running that to meet my mom. She's come to collect me. And the teacher, I still remember her name, Mrs. Hardesty, nice woman, but clearly someone locked into a particular mindset, as you'll see in a moment. She runs after me and says, Mrs. Reddie, before you go, I must speak with you. And so my mum turns around, and as Mrs. Hardesty, she goes to my mum and says, Mrs. Reddie, I have to say your son is remarkably gifted. Well, of course, that's what every mother wants to hear, isn't it? Well, of course, my son's gifted, she says, but he's my son, he's gifted. She says, oh, absolutely. So, his proficiency with the English language is wonderful. He speaks so clearly. He just knows so much considering. And my mum says, considering what exactly? Well, considering that like he was born in Africa. And I says, no, he wasn't. He was born in St. Luke's Hospital here in Bradford. And besides which, my mum says, besides which I come from the Caribbean. I come from the island of Jamaica. Never been in Africa in my life. And also, my mum says, in Jamaica, our mother tongue is English. So English is the only language Anthony knows. Now, here's the thing. You might have thought that a really thick Bradfordian accent might have been a bit of a giveaway. But clearly wasn't, because all she could see was, in black skin, I was the other, therefore I should be put into an immigration centre. She quickly realised, well, the mistake the school had made. And then next day, I turned up to go to the immigration centre and says, no, Anthony, you don't belong here, like you need to go into the main school. So I went to the main school, and so I went from being a genius to being kind of average, like that. I tell that story in order to point to a number of things. Firstly, it's this sense of Britain has an empire. Not just any empire, it's the biggest empire the world has ever seen. So at its height, 24%, so a quarter of the world, belongs or is run by, controlled by one island that's 44,000 square miles in circumference. And Jamaica, Caribbean, is part of that empire, along with large swathes of Africa, large swathes of Asia and the Pacific. And then, of course, if you go to North America, then like the whole of Canada. And also within, and I should say this actually, in terms of my sister-in-law's family, even in South America, on the continent of South America, like you had, at that point, it's like British Guyana, now called Guyana. So Britain has, a quarter of the world has an empire. And the empire does a number of things, but fundamentally what it does is it solidifies this notion of white entitlement. It's the reason why there was a different relationship with Canada and Australia and the white settler colonists, because there was always a sense of a kinship between white people going abroad and creating settlements. And these other people who were black and brown were part of the empire. So actually, the reason why my parents were there is because the 1948 Nationality Act gave a right to every person in the Commonwealth to come and be domiciled in Britain. But of course, when they passed the law, and it's interesting that all the government papers now from the Home Office have now been made public, it was very clear that when they passed a provision in order to invite people from the Commonwealth, what they really hoped were white South Africans would come, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders would come. Those are the people they were hoping would come back to the motherland to help work because of the labour shortage post-Second World War. Ironically, those people did not come because actually their standard of living at that point was probably better than most Brits. So most white South Africans didn't come. Most white Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders didn't come. The people who came, the law of unintended consequences, were poor people from the black and brown bits. So firstly, the Caribbean, and many of you will know that why we call it the Windrush is because of the SS Empire Windrush, former troop ship that takes 492 people from various Caribbean islands and arrives on the 22nd of June, 1948 at Tilbury Docks. And then from that moment, right through to 1971, somewhere in the region of 500,000 Caribbean people come as the first initial settlers, and then people from the Indian subcontinent, and then into the late 60s, early 70s, people then from the African continent come. But it's important to remember, and I used to have a poster at home, I say at home, I used to have a poster in my student bedroom when I was a student at University of Birmingham that was created by the Anti-Racist Alliance. And it was a picture of Brixton High Road circa sometime in the 70s. So a place of real pluralism, real cosmopolitan picture of Brixton, and the headline said in bold, "We are here because you were there. We are here because you were there." So when I turn up at Usher Street Primary School, I'm there because of empire. I'm there because people colonized the Caribbean. They brought African slaves from Africa, people from across the Caribbean. My descendants were slaves. Reddie, R-E-D-D-I-E, is not an African name, it's a Scottish name. Lots of Scots who were exiled from Britain then went to the Caribbean, but then became slave owners. Because although they had been opposition to the British internally in Britain, in terms of being colonized, they were still white. And therefore, whiteness still became the badge of entitlement to go to some other place, having been exploited in Britain, but you then go to another place and then become the exploiters because of whiteness and slavery. So in the first story, I'm visible, I'm different, and my difference is a problem, and they have to try to find some way of correcting it. And so therefore, like, they take me to an immigration center. And as I said in the story, no one ever spoke to me. If they had simply said, "Anthony," no, they'd come to me said, "Actually, what's your name?" "My name's Anthony." Heard the Yorkshire accent. I said, "Well, just out of interest, where were you born?" And I would tell them I was born in St. Luke's Hospital, because I heard the story. That would have saved a whole lot of confusion. But all they saw was the skin, therefore I must be foreign, therefore I must be socialized. Now, here's the thing about it. It was so ignorant because I didn't even know anything about British history. My mother tells the story of growing up in Jamaica with English or British education. Didn't know anything about Africa. As a British colony, they were taught British history. And British social manners were the ones that governed Jamaica. So pounds, shilling and pence, and I look around and I see a few grey hairs here. So I suspect that some of you will remember the days when shops closed for half day on a Wednesday. That's the era that my parents grew up in. So when they came to Britain, they knew the British really well because that's what they had been taught. And yet having exported Britishness and whiteness, they then had no idea of these people that they had created. So when they then come back, firstly there's alarm and shock, and then you have the crudity of a immigration centre that's trying to socialise people who have already been British for centuries into being British. And that contestation of you're British, but you're not really British, then gets played out in the wondrous generation being deported. So people who are invited here end up being deported because the truth is, however long you are here with dark skin or with black skin, somehow it means you don't really belong. That's the first story. Second story, much quicker. About 5 years ago. At the time, I'm working for the Methodist Church, and we have a new policy around supervision. So it's supervision training for every minister has to have supervision in order to try and bring about better safeguarding. And it comes on the back of a major report that shocked the church around abuse in the life of the church. Anyway, that's just background. So we come to the meeting in a conference centre at Highley that some of you may have been to. And the trainer who's leading it is essentially devises an exercise, it's the kind of thing I've done on many occasions, in order to try and help the group just to see how diverse we are in terms of all the different skills and experiences and learning that we bring as a cohort who are going to be the first group who will be trained in order to use this supervision training. So there's 25 of us in the room, 24 white people, and I'm the only black person. And so we sit down, and then the person does this icebreaker. And in the 45 minutes that we do the icebreaker, the weird thing is that we explore every element of difference except the elephant in the room, which is that I'm the only black person. So in the exercise, we established that some people were born in the north and some were born in the south. We established that some people are ministers and some are lay. We established that some of us have degrees and some of us don't. We established that some of us are Methodists, but it's an ecumenical group, and some are URC, and some are Baptists, and some are Anglicans. So 45 minutes going through every single facet, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, so how is it that you can't see that all of you are white except me? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not particularly perturbed about the fact that I'm the only black person. It just seems odd that that's the most immediate thing that strikes me, but doesn't seem to strike anyone else. Anyway, so we do this exercise, say 45 minutes, all the different permutations of even the fact that not all of us are born in Britain. Now, what's interesting is that there are 3 white South Africans in the room. 3 white Methodist ministers who were trained in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa and have come to Britain and are serving in the British Methodist Church. So, of course, like we notice their difference because not everybody's born in Britain. But I'm the only black person. And anyway, I sit and I decide that I'm not going to say anything. So at the end of it, the trainer says, well, as we can see, we have a very diverse group. Is there anything that strikes you about the group? And I'm sitting there, now short of getting up and doing a tap dance in the middle of the room and singing a song, how on earth do you miss the fact that there's one black person in the room? No one notices. Anyway, so I figure I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to keep quiet. So like we're here for 3 days. I'll see at what point anyone acknowledges that there is a non-white person in the room. It's on the final morning when I'm sat at breakfast and one of the white South Africans, who's a good friend of mine, comes up to me and I'm sat at the table by myself. It says, do you mind if I join you? I said, of course you can. He sits down and he says, Anthony, he says, is it me? Is it me, or is it that we seem to have missed the elephant in the room? And the elephant in the room, and he phrased it brilliantly, he says, and the elephant in the room is blowing its trunk very, very loudly, and it's defecating all over the place, and we're still ignoring it. I said, what makes you say that? He says, well, it's just that, he says, I've been in ministry in this country now for 15 years. And I've served in a number of contexts, and the latest context I'm in is a very multicultural, very plural area of South London, Lambeth. And everything it says about this course assumes that everybody's white, middle class, and metropolitan. It says, I can't see how this is going to work for some of the ministers I work with in my circuit. He was a superintendent minister. And it says, and why aren't we even talking about our fundamental differences? Which, he says, for me, in terms of this room, it's race and class. Race, he says, because clearly you're different. And not only are you different, he says, but like you have a wealth, he says, I've been taught by you. And I know that you have a wealth of theological insights about issues of power. And why is that not coming up at all? Then, of course, he says, then we've got issues of class as well. And like we're not talking about those at all, and yet we're talking as if somehow that yes, we've explored our differences, but they're largely superficial in comparison to some of the bigger issues. The most fundamental one, he says, is that why is it that there's 3 white South Africans in the room, but only 1 black person from Britain? And I remember I didn't say anything to him. I said, well, you know, I said, that's a really important insight. I think you should raise it with the rest of the group. He didn't. A few weeks later, when we were asked to give our evaluation around this initial training, I remember sending in a report that was really quite scathing and said, I was quite pleased about my alliteration, actually. You know, I mean, I remember sort of saying, it seems easier to become, if you can part this cohort, it's easier if you come from Bloemfontein than if you come from Bradford. So why is it that whiteness seems to be so endemic in our church, and yet we can sit in a room and not even acknowledge that for all the so-called differences, it's still a monochrome group in many respects, except for one individual who's here. So 2 stories, 2 contrasting ways. First one, difference is visible and problematic. Second one is, let's pretend it doesn't exist. And I think both of those things have a theological rationale behind it. So all that to say, we're now going to go into our exercise in a moment. But let me just pause for a second, because I've thrown a lot at you via these 2 stories. Are there any immediate thoughts or questions or reflections anyone would like to make before we go into the exercise? Darlene. Unmute yourself.
I think I just want to reflect on the second one, because I want to support what Anthony said. Obviously, I'm the white South African who is also an immigrant. And I work with Andrew Matmara, who is also a URC minister, but from Zimbabwe. And when he did his dissertation, he did it on hybrid ministry. And in the sense of all of us who came as immigrants are hybrids. I mean, we've got our roots, our African roots, but we kind of form a new personality, new character. And what I remember saying to Andrew Matmara, I mean, I use my whiteness, and I know I do that, and I'm quite open about it. I use my whiteness in the sense of and I work very much with refugees. When I'm in churches, I say to people, oh, but you are so good with welcoming the stranger, and you know, and I kind of carry on like that. And then I can see they kind of, because then I say, because you are so welcoming to me and my family. And in the sense of saying, but because I'm white, you must be thinking like us as British people. and you fit in so well. But kind of explaining to them that it might look like I fit in well because I'm white, but I have the same roots as Andrew Matmahara from Zimbabwe. I feel closer to him because we have the same roots. So I kind of use it as a leverage to show people that just because I'm white doesn't mean I have to adapt to your culture. Because, I mean, yes, I was a British colony, but I'm African. Um, and and I think that I can only explain it from my whiteness, but I am different, and I don't think people see that because I'm white. Where with black people, they automatically think they're different. So that's all I want to kind of say. You know, it's just as hard for me to adapt to British culture, I think, than any other immigrant. So apart from I'm a bit more accepted.
Gary, did you have a question? You'll have to mute yourself, Gary, if that's all right.
Oh yeah, well it is, to myself, back in say of like say 1945, when the war was on, a lot of people was took in different places and separated from families, and from there things went separate ways. So like families didn't even see each other. It's like I could put it. It's like a tutorial army where you wouldn't know what was going on back them days. So if you go back and study back history, like Martin Luther King, he brought rights into this country all over, and he did visited Britain. Don't forget, and he did bring out rights. And then in the past years, uh, in Britain, there was if you go beyond of calling other people like what you're talking about, blacks and Asians and all this lot, it shouldn't. You can get done for it now because it's the law. Because we're all equal as one individual people in this country. You know, it's like if I go for a job and say, and there's different people in the room, it doesn't matter because we're all in this together. You know, it's not. I can put it's a different background of way you're seeing things, but a lot of people don't see it as people see it because a lot of people in different countries, just different people, like America, Africa, Jamaican, everywhere you go. But there's got to be there is a law now where you can't go beyond of racism as it is because it's definition of you talking and seeing people in different ways. It's like you say, it's like if you went to school and you got different people mixed and people don't like it. Well, it's got to be as it is in this world because you got to talk to people, and if you don't mix with the people, it doesn't help. And but things are changing, and it's like now it's like there was thing up in America where a guy got killed saying get off my neck, I can't breathe. And it's and this is bringing in rights for us. I mean, he was doing things and the police went beyond it, and he didn't break the law, but he was in the car, but things happened, didn't they? But it shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. Has anybody else got any questions or comments before we move on to the next?
Monica, Lee.
Oh, sorry, Monica. Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, does anyone want to respond to Gary? Or I could say what I was going to say.
If you wish to respond.
I can say what I was going to say, which is kind of following on from Anthony, but I worked as a doctor. I am involved in people with chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, and the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, has just produced a guideline on caring for people with ME. And it's really, really good because it starts to look at the issues that people with ME have had to face, that it's not been recognised, it's not been accepted as a physical illness. And they've started to move on and say that means people have lost trust, and we actually don't know how to treat it. So that's absolutely fantastic. But if you look through that document, there is no mention of people from Black or ethnic minority backgrounds, despite the fact that the evidence clearly says that those people feel really disadvantaged, even more than most people with ME. So they've got a double whammy, and they really have. You know, it's just not accepted. For instance, if you're Black at school and you're not working, your teacher is very much more likely to say you're lazy than to look at why you might not be working. What you might be ill, there might be family problems. What they'll do is simply say, you're lazy. And so I'm trying to see if I can build a case to put back to NICE saying, we need to be much more explicit about the needs of Black and ethnic minority communities here. I've made contact with Richard already, who's going to try and look for some contacts for me. I've been trying now for a couple of weeks, trying to make contact. I haven't got enough leads. So if anyone else has, please get back to me.
Okay, I think we'll now do the exercise. Now, as I said, so here's the good news. I'll say it again. You cannot be wrong. Just to reassure you. Here it goes. Now, I want you to imagine, obviously, if we were doing this physically, like we'd have lots of fun because I get you all to stand up and we'd kind of move around and we'd see where we stood in relation to other people. Obviously, we can't do that, so we'll do it numerically instead. Imagine a line from 1 to 20, okay? At one end of the room, at number 1, is where the emphasis around when we think about sameness and difference is very much around sameness. It's around the things that we have in common, the things that make us all the same. That's at number 1. And that's like the most extreme version. So therefore, number 2, you're still of that belief, but not as strong as number 1. And you go down to, so you go down from 1 down to let's say number 10. On the other side of the divide, if you start at number 20, the other side of the room, is where the emphasis really is upon difference. It's upon what makes us particular. And all of us have some type of particularity, whether it's in terms of ethnicity, whether it's in terms of language, whether it's in terms of class or gender. All of us have some kind of niche. So on the other end, number 20 would be the most extreme version of a kind of particularity. However you understand that. So it might be in terms of ethnicity. So for example, I'm Caribbean by ancestry in terms of my parents, but I'm really Yorkshire. Well, actually, I'm really Bradford. I'm an eldest child, I'm male. There are all kind of lots of different ways in which I could name myself. And if that particularity is more important than the things that make us the same, then you'll be on this side. 20 would be the strongest, 11 would be kind of like the weakest. Now, here's the thing. because I know everyone's going to try second guess me. Trust me, I've done this before. And they're going to try hover for the middle. You can't do that. So here's the thing. You can choose any number from 1 to 8, or any number from 12 to 20. So you cannot choose 9, 10, or 11. So either 1 to 8, which is the emphasis is upon what we have in common. What are the things that make us, if not the same, then very, very similar? So things like all of us are human beings. All of us can love. All of us can have a relationship with other people. All of us are loved equally by God. These are all important theological as well as cultural things that are very, very real. Now, again, to be clear, both sides are equally right, and both sides have problems at the same time. So again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Whichever side you find yourself on and whichever number you give yourself, I'm going to invite you in a moment, you're not wrong. There is something to be said for both of those things, on whichever side. But and also I think the other thing to say as well is that these things are not fixed. So therefore, whatever number you give yourself now, that's probably informed by the stories I've told, probably informed by the topic we're looking at. You're sitting here. If we did this on another day, it would still be you, and you could choose entirely another number for a whole set of other reasons that would equally be true. Okay? So any number from 1 to 8, 12 to 20, I'm going to give you a minute or so to think about that, and then we're then going to go and see where you plot yourself on this list, and we'll see what we shall see. I can't wait. This is going to be interesting. So start thinking, folks. And I'll count down a minute from now.
Gary, yeah?
Was it 1 to 20? Or was it
Yeah.
1 to 20?
1 to 8, 1 to 8, and 12 to 20.
Yeah,
12, 1 to 8 and 12 to 20?
Yeah.
Yeah, or 12 to 20. Is that it? Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
correct.
All right. All right, thanks, cheers.
10 seconds. Three, two, one. Here we go. Right. I will call out the numbers. If you chose that number, please raise a hand. So we'll start with number 1. Anyone at number 1? Number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Okay, so a couple at 5. Number 6. Number 7. Okay, we're at number 7. Number 8. Actually, I just realised that I can only see. I just realised that I can only see one page. So obviously, unfortunately, okay, that's blown that idea. Okay, so we'll swiftly move on. So we got to 8. Number 12. Thank you. Number 13. 14. 15. 16. 17. 18. 19. 20. Okay, so quite a lot of a spread in a very unscientific way. Well, obviously, there's nothing about this is scientific, but if bear in mind, I could not sort of see both pages at the same time. It seemed that more people were on the 12 to 20 side than on the 1 to 8 side. And I've done this a few times, and I keep meaning to think that I should do some analysis of people's answers. I mean, the reason why I don't is because that's not important, as we'll see in a moment. It's more the thinking around the different sides of it rather than any specific numbers. But am I right to assume that most of you here are URC?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
I definitely am not.
Okay, yes, I hear a very defiant voice there. Okay.
But by the way, I did on number 12 to 20. I did pick 11. I missed the beginning.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, John. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting in that I did this early back in the, well, I tell you, it feels like another existence now. I did this pre-lockdown in about February with a group of Anglicans. And most of them actually sort of did that, the kind of 1 to 8 side. And therefore, I'm wondering whether there's something about a different ecclesiology that maybe influences how people think about these things. I mean, as I said, it's not fixed, and we could do it tomorrow. You could do different numbers, and it would be equally valid. Okay, so let's just kind of unpack this then for a bit. So the 1 to 8 side. So raise your hands again if you are broadly on any number between 1 to 8. Please raise your hands. So 1, 3, 4. Let me go
and
to
and Monica as well. Monica's put her hand up.
Yeah,
you can see.
Monica as well. Yeah. So okay. So there's a few of you on the 1 to 8 side. Now, as I said, there are no moral judgments being made here. But so on the 1 to 8 side, a fundamental truth is, and a particular way which the church has handled racism and tried to be anti-racist, is this assertion that we are more alike than unalike. And there's a fundamental truth in that. There is a fundamental truth in that. So there's nothing wrong necessarily with trying to assert a sense of shared identity. And Christianity does that in a number of ways. At one level, we say that God loves all of us, one thing. We also say as a fundamental truth that all of us are created in the image and likeness of God, equally in the image and likeness of God, knowing full well that at various points in history, the church has been guilty of colluding with ideas that some people were more like God and other people were not. And some people actually were just not even human, even to have any relationship with God. So therefore, to assert a sense of sameness or similarity is hugely important. And there's a fundamental truth in that. So another story I could have told, I won't go into detail, I'll just give the bare bones of it to show, again, how notions of difference can be problematic. That first, well, it wasn't the first day at school, it was probably about the second or third day. I was sat in, tell I did. Actually, not tell actually, it must have been some point later in the week, the first 3 days I was in the immigration centre. So came out of that, I'm now in normal school, sat next to this white kid who's been a good friend of mine ever since. That's why I'll name him, called Neil Cousins, really nice guy. But I'm sat there and suddenly I feel this pain in my arm and I turn around and he's biting me. Anyway, so I say to him in no uncertain words, actually, so what the hell are you doing? Although that's not the words I use. And he responds, he says, I want to see what colour blood you have because my nana says that you people have different blood. And so obviously teacher comes by like there's red blood coming out and say, well, I don't know what colour blood you've got, but mine's red. In his mind, from what his grandma had told him, he assumed that there was some fixed biological differences. What we know, and the reason why we often say race in inverted commas, is because it's a construct. There's no such thing as race. There's only one race. That's the human race. If I was involved in an accident and I needed a blood transfusion or a transplant, it's just as likely that anyone in the screen in front of me could be a donor rather than someone in my own family. because there's no such thing as black blood or black organs or African organs. There is one race, the human race. Race is a construct. So therefore, to assert a notion of shared identity has always been one of the key things that the church has tried to assert as a way of being countercultural in a world where issues of difference and hierarchy and race have often been played out to very corrosive and dangerous levels. So on that side of the divide 1 to 8, it is important on many occasions that we assert our shared identity. That like we talk about all of us being loved by God, we talk about our shared thing about being human beings. That's hugely important. And actually one of the critiques that the church made, certainly at its best, was this upholding of sameness as a fundamental marker for being Christian. So for example, a really good book, I mean, for those who are into reading books and stuff, I mean, it's not everyone's thing, is by an African-American guy called Willie James Jennings. And the book is called, The Christian Imagination. Won lots of awards, one of the most profound books on the origins of race actually written. The Christian Imagination. And basically its subtitle is like the origins of race. And what Willie James Jennings says, he says that one of the things about the Christian imagination, it didn't last for as long as it should have done. But he says that one of the geniuses of Paul, St. Paul, and I'm not always Paul's greatest fan for a whole set of reasons that we'll get to in a moment. But he says, but one of the geniuses of Paul and those early apostles was this way of creating a new religion that turns on its head all the normal markers of belonging. Because so all the normal markers of belonging in terms of anthropology, well, it would be land. If you share land, if you share geographical space, lineage, if you share blood, if you're family, there are kinship ties, ethnicity and culture, if you share a particular set of traditions. In terms of Judaism, if you share origins and cultures and particular norms, all these are the normal ways in which people identify with other people. All of it is normal. And therefore issues of nationalism and tribalism all come from these basic building blocks of what it means to belong. So for example, I come from Bradford, West Yorkshire. It's often said that like you can take the man out of Yorkshire, but you can't take Yorkshire out of the man. I'm more Yorkshire because I've not lived there for 36 years. I'm a fiercely proud Bradfordian. So even now when people say, are you from Birmingham? I say, no, I live in Birmingham, but I'm not from it. I'm not a Brummie. I could live here for 100 years and never be a Brummie. I'm a Yorkshire guy. I've retained the accent partly by, I think, choice and partly because I'm just not going to pick up accents. But actually, there's a sense in which part of my identity in tribal terms is because I come from Yorkshire. Paul's early writings, particularly Galatians 3:28, says, well, actually, all those normal markers are not significant because within the ecclesia, within the household of God, membership is two basic things: baptism and believing in the saving work of Jesus Christ. Those two things make you a Christian. And circumcision and all those other cultural things, and you see a lot played out in Paul's letters. All those natural markers, it's not that they don't exist, it's just that they're not as important as our shared identity in this historical figure called Jesus Christ, who dies for us and atones for our sins. That is a revolutionary idea, says Willie James Jennings. The problem is, of course, as he said, it was hard for the church to hold it together. And if you look at Paul's writings to the people in Galatia and Corinth and Thessalonica and these various places, it's because that powerful theological idea is an idea. It's based upon particular practices, but of course, it then runs up against the natural proclivity we have around those other markers that are very strong. And so very quickly, says Willie James Jennings, the church then still wants to hold to this idea of sameness, similarity. But that then gets challenged by the natural things that we all live in different countries, we live in different states, we live in different principalities, we live in different kinship groups. And those things are still impinging upon us because before we get to heaven, we're still on earth and we're still in these places that have these markers. And therefore, Willie James Jennings says that the church is already struggling with difference before notions of power and economics come into it in terms of enslavement and empire. His latest book is a bit more accessible because The Christian Imagination is a great book, but it's a bit of a heavy read. So this year, his sequel was called After Whiteness. And After Whiteness is more poetic and has more stories in it. But essentially what it is this follow-up that says, well, actually, one of the things that we need to deconstruct in order, if we want to assert this sameness, the 1 to 8, what we have to do is to deconstruct empire and deconstruct whiteness, because this is the downside now of 1 to 8. Everything I've said is true. It's not that it's not true, it's just that the problem is that obviously, like, we don't live in a contextless vacuum. All of us live in the real world and we're shaped by history. And the problem with notions of sameness is that most empires are based on the notion of sameness. That i.e. what empires try to do is to replicate themselves in other parts of the world. And of course, we see that with the British Empire. Therefore, part of the problem with sameness is, so what are we the same as? Well, okay, like we could say like all of us are the same as Jesus. Yeah, but not all of us are Judean Jews living in the 1st century. So therefore, what are we the same as? If you're not careful, sameness ends up being the same as the people with the power to project their ideas on others. And Christianity is as guilty as that as any other philosophy around sameness. So sameness then, at its worst, ends up being a way of not deconstructing racism, but actually reinscribing it. And as I said, the British Empire has a way of doing that. So when it exports Christianity, it doesn't export a vacuumless, contextless Christianity. It exports a white, particularly English, particularly middle class and upper class form of faith that then colonizes everyone else and says that their existing cultures are terrible, says that they have no connection with God before the Europeans or the British people turn up, and at worst, turns them into slaves. And that sense of oneness, even though the church proclaims it, when it's inconvenient, it then steps away from it. So let me give one quick example, then we'll pause, give you a chance to reflect, and then we'll go on to the other side, the 12 to 20, because that again has powerful things to say theologically, but also problems. In about 1720, a group of enslaved Africans in America became Christians. They weren't encouraged to become Christians at this particular point. There were missionaries in the mission field on plantations, but they were largely there to look after the souls and the well-being of the white planter class, not the enslaved people who were there. But however, some of them did become Christians. But there was a problem, because actually when some of these enslaved Africans became Christians, another of them down tools and said, well, actually, like, we're free now, because your faith says, we have heard it said, there's freedom in Christ. Therefore, if we're free, we're no longer slaves, we're not doing any more work, down tools. obviously, this is not what their slave masters had in mind when they became Christians. So they go to the leading missionary. This is the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, SPG, now USPG. Obviously, I tell the story with great relish when I'm talking to Anglicans. Obviously, it don't quite work the same, obviously, with URC and Reformed and whatever. But if it was Anglicans now, I would be saying, yeah, you lot, US. You lot, Anglicans, you know? So anyway, so they go to the main mission person and they say, you need to write to the Bishop of London, because Bishop of London has jurisdiction of the Americas. It's part of the London diocese, so we need a ruling. So they write, so the mission writes a long letter. It's still in the archives now of USPG. Writes a long letter saying we need a ruling because these enslaved people are saying that they're free. The Bishop of London, of course, is not impartial because he knows that these letters come from rich, powerful planters who are giving lots of money to the Anglican Church in the form of tithes. So therefore, he's not impartial. He writes back and says, my definitive ruling is that freedom in Christ and baptism is only in spiritual matters. They are spiritually free, but they are still have to obey the law of the land. And his justification for that, he says, well, actually, of course, the truth is in the scriptures, nowhere is slavery of non-Jewish people ever abolished. Indeed, Paul himself says, and obviously these are the bits that were always preached to the enslaved. In Colossians 3:22, Ephesians 6:5, slaves obey your masters, as if you were obeying your Father in heaven. In the book of Philemon, Onesimus runs away from Philemon to Paul. Paul writes a very gracious letter, which is obviously is what we have recorded in the canon, to Philemon, sends Onesimus back and says, treat him as a brother. Give him more respect as a brother in the faith, but he's still an enslaved person. Therefore, even though the church had propagated this notion from its earliest times as around the unity in faith in Jesus Christ, it then contradicts its own teachings because there's money involved. Empire, money, whiteness becomes one of the ways in which a sameness, whilst theologically true, can also be problematic when it is distorted under the aegis of empire and whiteness. I'll pause there for a moment. Any immediate thoughts before we then go on to look at how difference is both a powerful theological idea in terms of anti-racism, but also in its own self, again, problematic?
I did one of my master's essays on Philemon, and it always struck me, the question of whether Paul would have helped him had he not converted, because the language about him beforehand was different than it was after he'd converted. And so it got me thinking about the roots of that kind of Christianity, of it just being sways of conversion and that being the important thing as a prerequisite for any help or aid. And it really kind of, and I wrote it in the kind of origins of slavery and human trafficking. Yeah. And it made my blood run cold, because I'd read it loads of times, but then, you know, when you see something and you can't unsee it, and it was like, he wouldn't have helped him had he not converted. You can almost see the way the book goes in that sense, and how that still is a view taken now, even now in and so there's a sameness in the sense of, if you become the same, then absolutely you're in this, but it's sameness on terms, isn't it? And that's the really icky part of it, which I think Christians are still really we can be really guilty of prescribing that same method of interactions and relationships.
It is, yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah, you know, and it's interesting. So, for example, like the long history of mission schools that were created in many parts of the world were often predicated upon that. You know, I mean, you know, I'm not. So, for example, a guy who many of you will know. Well, I say no. I mean, I shouldn't assume, but he's a really good friend of mine. So, Reverend Dr. Michael Jagassar, a URC minister, who's Indo-Caribbean. So I can never get it exactly right. So it's either his mother was a Hindu and his dad was a Muslim, or the other way around. But actually, one of the reasons why he's a Christian, he says, is because his parents sent all of them, that in Ghana, like in the particular village where he came from, like the best school was a Christian school. But like you had to be a Christian to go to it. And his parents figured that actually, even, although they were both Muslim and Hindu, they were not strongly religious. That's probably why they were able to get married in the first place. Therefore, because they were not strongly religious, they then decided that on balance, they would rather their children convert to Christianity, or at least say they would carry a Christian identity in order to get into the best school in that place, which then set Michael up, obviously being a very bright boy, to then go to university. And there's a sense in which across the whole of the empire, education was often a very contractual way of getting people out to change identities. Now, obviously, it's a double-edged thing, because actually a lot of the anti-colonial leadership came from people who went to those schools. So, you know, so Nelson Mandela went to a church school, as did Desmond Tutu and various other people. So, of course, and this one in the Caribbean. So, of course, you know, I mean, it's a very complicated story. But yeah, you're right. You know, it's if Onesimus had not converted, that might have been a very different narrative. Any other points before we move on quickly? Tom.
Just a question, really. My biblical knowledge is not quite up to scratch as the people here, but isn't some of what Paul may have written not actually Paul? And so it's a bit of a difficult one with some of the more troubling language in some of Paul's writings when it comes to slavery and oppression. I mean, I might be wrong here because I'm with this, but yeah, it's like, and I appreciate as well that the language in the Bible can be utilized in any way people want to use it, which can be great and, of course, in past terrible, as you've spoken about.
Yeah.
But, I mean, when it comes to a theological point of view on that, is it not a bit dodgy to use it as a theological argument?
In what sense? Sorry.
Well, if Paul didn't actually write what is in the Bible, and it says it's Paul, then should we be using that anyway? That's a horrible question. I'm sorry.
It is. Well, look, I think that is one of the issues I think scholars always wrestle with, because obviously these texts are written thousands of years ago and not in English anyway, so like they're written in different language, and of course actually like we know that the provenance of that is disputed. And also I think even within the context, in fairness to Paul, that the slavery he's talking about is not chattel slavery. It's a different type of slavery. And I think for those who are more sympathetic to Paul, I mean, I don't hate Paul in any particular sense, I'm just not his greatest fan for a whole set of other reasons. That also I think that what a lot of scholars would say is that whether Paul wrote it or not, and those are questions that people wrestle over, is also the sense in which he's writing in the belief that Jesus' second coming will happen within his own lifetime. So therefore what there's also going on is this sense of there are these major serious social issues, but actually, given that Jesus is going to come back anytime soon and sort them out anyway, the really important question is how then do we sort ourselves out as a community of love in terms of this shared identity? So those are the really important things, because all our social differences actually that will be obliterated actually at the Perusia anyway. That is, I think, one of the kind of sort of defense that people can make for Paul's not taking a stronger line against slavery. I think the view I've often taken is not to attribute blame to the biblical writers, because in fairness, notions of race did not exist in their time. I think our problem is, and we'll see this actually when we get to the second part, look at the other part, is that, of course, all of us, and I say all of us, are very selective in the bits that we choose to read in a literalist fashion, and the bits that we want to complicate, are the bits that I would just ignore. So, of course, for slave owners, it was entirely consistent to say, well, Paul says, slaves obey your masters. If we exegete it, Paul is not writing for people in the 16th century who are holding, not 16, for people in the 18th century who are holding slaves. Paul is writing for that community in first century Middle East, Mediterranean, who think that Jesus is going to come back anytime soon. Clearly, those same people are not the ones who are then also looking at other biblical texts where it says, well, actually, it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than it is. It's easier for camels to go through the eye of a needle than it is like for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Clearly, rich slave owners are not reading that text and taking it literally. So the truth is, all of us are very selective about the biblical texts we use in order to make our arguments. Great question, though, Tom. Inadequate answer because people do PhDs on this stuff. So, you know.
I had a question, but I think I will wait until you finish the second group, and then I will make the question, Anthony, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Cheers, thank you.
Right, okay then. So let's quickly then go on to part two. So part two, 12 to 20. Now, on the face of it, this seems kind of better, you know. I mean, obviously, a lot of you have kind of opted for 12 to 20. So hands up if you went on the 12 to 20 side. Hands up. Ooh, yeah. Okay, so it's like the greater majority of people on the 12 to 20 side. There we go. Right, okay, so start off then with the obvious theological advantages of this. An obvious theological advantage is that most of the activist movements, particularly I'm thinking in terms of contextual theologies, thinking in terms of theologies of liberation, will naturally gravitate initially from this side, 12 to 20 on the other side. And the reason why is because obviously what you have on 12 to 20, probably the further you go to 20s, the more distinct it becomes, is this thing about being able to name particularity. That all of us are human beings, but all of us are always particular type of human beings. Life is lived in particular places, and 12 to 20 has a way of emphasizing that in a much easier way than 1 to 8. So 12 to 20, much easier, for example, if you're a feminist and you say, well, actually, I know that I live in a world where patriarchy and male power has dominated my life. I've been born to this body and I'm assumed to be, and I'm treated as less than just because of that fact. Therefore, being a woman, I'm still a Christian, but being a Christian woman and being someone who wants to rethink Christianity through the lens of gender is more likely to exist on this side because of particularity. Black theology, I'm a Black theologian. The Black power movements and Black liberation movements, again, it's not that they don't borrow the language of oneness and sameness. I think what they might well say is that's a great aspiration, but you know, it's rarely played out in reality. Therefore, what we're going to do is to do the opposite, is to emphasize those things that we've been told that we should be embarrassed about or ashamed about, because actually these are the things that make us who we are. And we're not going to apologize for that. So therefore, also on the 12 to 20 side is that way in which you appropriate language. So oftentimes language that's used to oppress you, you take the language back and and you give it new meaning in order to disempower it, exists on this side. And there are theological markers for talking about difference on this side. So whether it's like Pentecost, actually, there was a really interesting relationship between Babel in the Old Testament in Genesis and Pentecost in the two, because actually what you could say is that Pentecost is a kind of addition to and a way of redeeming Babel. So the Tower of Babel story, for those of you who don't remember, humanity seems to be united. So in theory, that seems like a good thing. And basically, they believe that if they climb this tower and they get to the top, then like they will become gods. They will become almost the equal of God. And God, interesting enough, in a plural voice, which is obviously one of the inferences people then take around, therefore there being a trinity, says, well, actually, we will give them language to confuse them and to divide them, which on the face of it seems, well, so what's wrong with this unity? Well, of course, what people often say is that unity is a bit like empire from 1 to 8, that we will make ourselves the masters, says humans in that bit, and God divides it. But that division is seen as a negative thing. Pentecost, in some respects, almost redeems it. So Pentecost, on the day of Pentecost, we see people speaking in their different language, in their different mother tongues, in their different cultures. And that is often seen as a way of breaking down empire. So actually, when people are transformed by the Spirit, they don't all speak Koinonia Greek. So they all don't speak like the language of empire. They speak in their own language. And therefore, one of the roots of the way in which we think about difference theologically comes from that. Actually, another way actually then comes from like the risen Christ. So we know Jesus, earthly Jesus, is a Jew. The risen Christ is where 2 or 3 are gathered in any place across time and space, that Jesus is there. And Jesus takes on their identity. That's another way, again, of talking about difference. So another way of being anti-racist is to critique sameness, not that sameness is bad, but to critique sameness when it's based upon a notion of empire or power, in this case, usually particularly around whiteness, and then says, but actually, particularity, however you understand it, is another way of challenging racism, because what it says is, it says actually like there's value in our difference. Our different cultures are not problematic per se, it's the values we put around that. Difference itself is not a problem, it's that we always inevitably want to try and create a hierarchy around difference. But what if we could think of unity in diversity? So on this side, our particularity becomes important. So for example, if I were choosing a number, I would be something like 17 or 18 at best, and probably 20 on a really militant day. On a really, really super, I'm going to be like a super black man, black theologian. I'm taking a sledgehammer, breaking down the wall, and I'm pushing it out like to number 30. That doesn't exist, but I'm going to invent number 30. That's what I'm like some days. That's because there was something about the particularity for me that's important. Now, here's a downside, because, and there's a downside, because as I said, none of these are perfect. And I might invite Richard maybe to say something at this point, because I know that some of his research will touch on some of this. That's one of the downsides of 12 to 20 is that the more you emphasize particularity and particularly group identity, is that like the logic of that. So let's say if 1 to 8, if you push it to its end extreme and we're all the same, and you say the same as what, that if the logic of that can lead to empire, this is 1 to 8, then 12 to 20 the logic of that can lead to ethnic cleansing. Because it ends up then with it being, well, of course, it's my group that's really better than your group. It's my group that has righteousness. It's my group that owns this land. It's my group that God is really speaking to us. And we have theologies of election where we believe that some people, some traditions believe that people are predestined. And it's interesting that when you look at the groups who do that, the ones who are predestined, they always look a bit like the people who are saying it. So, for example, whether it's in South Africa and you have like the Dutch Reformed Church who believe in election, it's interesting, very interesting that like the people who are predestined to be saved just happen to be white European Boers. So funny is that, isn't it? It's funny that God just happens to choose the prejudices that we have in order to justify our theological position. So actually, so one of the downsides of this is a fragmentation that then says, well, if we are so much locked into our particularity, where then does unity come from? How then do we assert ourselves as having things in common if we're so intent upon talking about what makes us distinct? And as I said, I'll maybe, well, not maybe, I will stop for a moment and then invite Richard to just say something about his research, because if you think about some of the worst examples of ethnic cleansing or of genocide, they often come from a position whereby a particular group believes itself either its historic rivalry or it's a more cynical sort of divide and rule by empire, that then rather than affirming that people have things in common, it's the division of a group from another that then can become the means by which truly horrific things happen because of people locked into a particular set of identity, a particular form of identity politics. Richard, do you want to say anything about that?
Thank you, Anthony. And as you have noticed, I went for number 5, and I will say why I went for number 5 later. Yeah. But I completely agree with the whole business of focusing on particularities or specific identifiers and the dangers that come with it. Obviously, as somebody who has been consumed with understanding and researching genocides, that goes without saying. It is interesting that all these particularities sometimes need to be given a sort of divine validation on some myths of origin to explain why they are actually important and why people should ascribe to them. Whether you look at Tutsis in Rwanda, and how the whole Hamitic myth, the fact that this could have been Indo-European of dark skin in Rwanda, who by election and their size and their beauty and their intellect could not be Bantu people, could not have as low born, as less intelligent as the Bantu people. And the danger of it is that it almost becomes natural that to counteract that sort of particularity, you have to create an opposing myth of majority. We are the Bantu, we are the Hutu people, we are the original occupiers of this land. These Hamitic, Nilotic people came from another place. And took over our country and took over our place. And so it's only right that we, the majority, have to be the person who are entitled. And it is very difficult when people have such extreme opposition to not come to blows. And sometimes, obviously, those conflicts can be quite extreme. I mean, we can see it from all over the world. But in Rwanda, it became something really absolutely sinister. It was really incredible to see how quickly things could degrade and how solidarities and societal foundations can be undermined by this sort of particularism, which is the reason why. But two reasons that I think I've always I choose number 5. It is that when you have survived that sort of extreme violence, it gives you a sort of insights in the sort of the politics of these constructs and how easily they can shift. How once you've gotten rid of the other, you end up creating other differences within. By the time the Tutsi were exterminated, you could already see the cracks appearing within what was sort of an ad hoc block of Hutu beginning to fragment. And then people began to look at some of the Hutus who were not pure Hutus, some of the Hutus who are from a different region, some of the Hutu who had physical morphologies that reminded people of the Tutsi. You see, so that ability to keep fragmenting into some form of difference, that's a problem. And the other thing is it's that you forget that there are people who are always by birth caught in the middle, that you are a child born of the Hutus and Tutsis, and that by a desire to survive and to adapt, you have to pinch things. You have to literally to be everything to everyone without being Anglican, so that you can fit in each side of the family. So when you go to sleep over in the Hutu family, you have to know the Hutu way of doing things. So, and I wonder if that biological imperative has conditioned me in seeking those elements in me that make me similar to others, so that I can find strategies of survival. That's my contribution. I don't know if it helps, but yeah.
No, thank you very much for that. And I think it's interesting that every time I've done this, every time I have met people who have been through similar experiences to yourself, they are always on the 1 to 8 side. Actually, I think my only surprise is that like you're as low as number 5.
Well, that is actually a joke. It's because I am one of 11 children, and I have 5 brothers and 5 sisters, and I'm number 5. So I'm more. I just choose 5 as a joke. I probably would have been close to 3, and 2 as an example. And you will see it even in national politics that when people have been in this conflict. Governments like the government of Rwanda would try to emphasize the fact that we are all Rwandans, irrespective of the fact that it hasn't been a long time that we were, we were not interested in that. But both sides realize how emphasis on extreme can lead to tragic consequences. So it's just, yeah. Sorry, I interrupted, Anthony.
Indeed, no, that's really, that's extremely helpful. And I think, so therefore, one of the things that we can think about is how each side offers a corrective to the other side. So, for example, as someone who has always been on the, not just the 12 to 20 end, but really most likely, usually, the other side of number 15. So 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, depending upon what day I do this. I know that I need the 1 to 8 side as a corrective of my natural way to be tribal in a type of self-righteous way. So I'm going to give you 2 very, very quick stories. Now, these are, how should I put this? These are ways of me critiquing myself. So don't go away and for 1 second think, oh, well, Anthony gave those two stories, and why? That's a good, no, they're not good stories. Okay, let me just say that right now. Okay, this is me critiquing myself. So about 10 or so years ago, I'm on Facebook, typing away. I get a friend request from a very, very attractive black woman. I'm single, so I think to myself, why not? She'll be my friend. Of course, click. Because, Anyway, so we're chatting away. I'm single, so it's not creepy here. I'm not doing anything bad. So we start to chat, and she lives not far away from Birmingham. So I said, okay, let's go for a coffee. So we go for a coffee. It's all going really well, swimmingly. Then, so Margaret Thatcher dies. And she says, well, I'm really heartbroken because Maggie was one of my heroes. I'm appalled because, I'm your classic Guardian reading, unreconstructed lefty liberal here, okay? So I might believe at a push that God loves Maggie as much as God loves me, although quite frankly, I'd be really bloody angry if that turned out to be true. But even so, I will concede that she was a human being. I will concede, but I can't stand the woman. Anyway, so this woman is telling me now how much she loves Maggie. I'm thinking to myself, well, I was going to ask her out on a date, but I don't think I can date a Tory, if I'm being honest with you. I'm going to be honest with you. I come from Bradford, West Yorkshire, the home of the Independent Labour Party. I'm a socialist. After all, Anthony, as in Anthony George Reddie, Anthony, I'm named after Tony Benn. I'm named after Tony Benn. My dad was a trade unionist. I can't date this woman anyway, so I'm polite because I'm well brought up. I said, okay, I humour her. I go home, I unfriend her. Click, no longer friends. She emails a couple of days later, said, I'm you've been quiet, so, anything gone wrong? I said, I've got to be honest with you, I can't be your friend. She says, but why? I says, because you're a Tory. She says, yeah, but, I said, no, I'm sorry, no, can't work. No Tories. I may have some Tories in my social circle, but they keep that to themselves because they know they told me that we'd have an argument. On a bad day, I am convinced that I'm right. On a bad day, I know I'm right. I know that, quite frankly, if people just read my books, here we are. He's got colorblind. Gentle plug. If people just read my books a little bit more, the kingdom of heaven would be that much closer, because I just know that I'm on the righteous right side of the argument. I said it as a joke, but actually, although that's probably a more benign prejudice, the truth is, at its worst, what 12 to 20 lends itself to is a kind of opposition whereby you define yourself not just by who are fellow travelers, but who are your enemies? Who are the people who are not like you? Who are the people who are just on the wrong side of the argument? And quite frankly, God should just damn them. It's benign, but of course, the truth is that that's the roots that then gets to the worst extremes that Richard was talking about. Therefore, I know that 1 to 8 is a corrective that says to me, Anthony, no matter how well self-righteous you are defining yourself, God is never reducible to any particular set of identity politics, no matter how well thought out those people believe them to be. And it's important to say that. Conversely, those who are on the 1 to 8 side, that what that then offers from the other side is the importance of particularity. It's the importance of not closing down diversity or closing down the voices of the people we often don't want to hear from. That it's not just about race, but it's then issues about class, issues of disability, issues of gender, issues of sexuality, all the things that often become the elephant in the room. So in order to maintain our unity, let's just close down those things that are not part of the main script. Let's just close that down because it's easier to maintain our unity if we can pretend that those awkward people who want to say something different are just not in the room, or we can just shut them up. Both are important for different reasons. Both have strengths, both have weaknesses. What I'm interested in now is, in our last in the last 20 minutes. I was going to start sending you into groups to break up. Well, actually, yeah, I think we can still do that for about 10 minutes. Okay, so okay, let's have maybe 4 groups.
Would you be all right to facilitate one then, Anthony? Would that be all right? Yeah?
Yeah.
Are you setting it up, Lee, or do you want me to?
I don't know how to keep people out of rooms. Like if I did it, all 4 of us would end up in the same room.
Okay,
so could you do it?
Just make me host.
Right, okay then. So what we'll do then, so basically, so we have Lee, Darlene, myself, and Richard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I make it that well, there's 29 of us, so that should be 4 groups of about 7-ish. Yeah? Okay, so this is what I want you to do for like the next 10 minutes or so. So, okay, so in group 1, if you look at Paul's letter to the Corinthians, so 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 to 31. So if group 1 and group 3 both look at Corinthians, so 1 Corinthians 12, verses 12 to 31, that's Paul's metaphor of the body in many parts. And if groups 2 and 4, if you then look at Acts chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, and that's the story of Pentecost. And basically what I want you to look at is just how is sameness and difference played out in these 2 texts. How is sameness and difference played out? So what things speak to sameness, what things speak then to difference or particularity? Okay, so 1 and 3 looking at Corinthians, 2 and 4 looking at Acts chapter 2.
Yeah, I'll write that up all in the chat now.
Lee Battles join us, so yeah.
Oh, yeah, obviously.
I'm just going to write what Anthony's asked us to do.
Oh, that's
just 1 second. Could you hear? Oh, Leslie, you stayed around for it, didn't you? Could you roughly explain it whilst I type it up? You're on mute.
Group 1 and 3, which is not us.
I have to apologize. I couldn't join room 3. I tried to get in, but I just couldn't. So room 3 didn't have a facilitator. I hope they were okay. I'm trying to drag myself in, but it just didn't want me to.
So very, very quickly, we don't have much time. Anyone from group 1 with just any immediate thoughts in terms of the Corinthian text?
So,
anyone?
Yeah. I was just saying about to be a strong fella. It's like you say, as you get older, you need to be strong for yourself, and just say like if I'm a bloke, like I said in group 1, imagine if a man has 20 million on your side, you've got to be strong to do that. But if you're walking the streets as a normal fella, it's a different world. So you've got to keep yourself fit on a different occasion. So it's 2 different things in a sense.
Okay, sorry. So I was asked to relay information from our group, Gary.
Yeah.
So what we were talking about with the body is that without all of us working together, the body will fail.
Yeah.
And that we all need the members of each different background of society to function together. Another important thing that we spoke about was the idea that without solidarity, without collaboration, then we're going nowhere. But also the idea that there shouldn't be a hierarchy, because no matter how important people may think certain members of society are, that there shouldn't be a hierarchy. And obviously, Rich said a great point that a professor does not exist without the student. And you know, it may be all well and good that someone who is high up is like that, but without the students, then you're not a professor. You're just someone who thinks you're really clever. So yeah, I also on another more kind of basic level, the idea of without having bin men, or without having the people who are seen as lower in society, so people on minimum wage, low skilled jobs, you know, who are integral to society. Without them, like, well, you know, the society fails.
That's exactly the same thing what Hitler did.
What?
Hitler, same thing. He was an unemployed world where he was living. He gained an army, but a lot of Jews died.
What?
And things happened, because it's like I'm just putting this into a bit of place, but Hitler went his own way because he was strong enough to do that, because where he was in Germany, it was an unemployed place. But in a sense, even though a lot of things happened like in different places, like the Auschwitz, that should have happened, but a lot of people died, they all went thin and no food, it's just rationing. But in a sense, with us in America, we all joined together as a strong community. And in the end, Hitler failed because he didn't get his own way.
I'm just going to move us on.
Can I clarify that was not a point that was discussed?
Yeah, well, nothing to do with us. So that's
in the group one. So that is an individual.
That was off me. I was just doing it out the room. Sorry.
Okay.
Let's move on. Okay, we'll go to group 4. So I think you looked at Pentecost. Anyone from group 4?
We were group 4, weren't we?
Yeah.
Yes, sorry. Bob, would it be okay if you fed back? Only because I was trying to put all the information into chat, so I missed a great part of the first bit that we were talking about, if that's okay. If you could unmute yourself, Bob, would that be? There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
You've done it.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, we said they were all filled with the Holy Spirit.
Yes. Yeah.
They're all sitting down together before it happened, so they're used to being together and doing things as one group. But then there's the sense of all their own languages. They're all from different places, and yet they all get drunk according to the crowd. And it's only when the crowd comes along that difference is emphasized, because the crowd demands an explanation of what they're actually up to. I think the other thing we did talk about declaring the works of God, and that language is okay, but actually to understand the mystery of God, language doesn't do much justice to the experience and being part of it. What else did we say? Did we say much else? Anybody else?
Yeah, that was probably about it.
Yeah, it was pretty much, yeah.
That's fine.
Thanks,
That's
Bob.
fine. Thank you very much, Bob. I'm aware of the time, so I won't drag this on too much, because as Lee said right at the start, our 2 hours has flown by, and I want to I think sort of contract with you, therefore like to end at the time that we sort of said that we would end. So I won't extend this last bit too much. As I said right at the start, what I'm trying to do is to give you some theological tools, really, for wrestling with issues of racism, particularly sort of systemic racism. And therefore, I just want to give 3 quick pointers that I think are significant for us as Christians and communities. So first is the personal. All of us have agency, and by that I mean all of us have a degree of power around how we engage with other people. And there's that wonderful quote that I think comes from Gandhi, I think originally, although Desmond Tutu kind of borrows it, and says that be the change that you want to see in the world. Be the change you want to see in the world. So all of us have the power to determine how we engage with the other. And I think key to that is this thing about being an ally. So like we've heard quite a lot of that. I mean, I don't really quite like the word ally because I think it's a bit wishy-washy. I want to talk about being an advocate. And being an advocate means simply this. It doesn't mean speaking for people, but it means that when you're in a place where someone is being reduced in their humanity, and that person is not there, or maybe is too weak to speak up for themselves, you are the advocate that does not let that go. I was taught that years ago by a lot of my feminist friends who would say, Anthony, why is it that in the meeting people were making sexist comments, or I think of a particular chair who always had a way of never seeing the hands raised by a woman, and would always then turn around and then sort of take all the men in turn. And they said, Anthony, I know that you say that you read feminist theology and you say that you're on our side, but why is it that like you never say anything? And I realized that actually it shouldn't be up to women to call out patriarchy. Therefore, it should not be up to Black and minority ethnic people to call out racism. One of the ways in which I think white people can be advocates is to say, actually, when you're in a group of white people and maybe minorities are not there and comments are made, or even actually, if you're in a group of white people, why aren't there other people there? Then who then raises that? Who raises that? All of us have the power within ourselves. We may not be able to change the world, but everyone has the power to be the thing that we want to be. To be the change that we want to see in the world at an individual level in terms of how we engage with other people. Therefore, when we see the other, do we see Christ in them? Do we see them as being more like us, but not in a sense of like you're just like me, but as in you are a person who is a complex human being who's more than just a stereotype. So one of the things about, I think it's the 3rd chapter of this book where I talk about self-discovery, and there's an exercise with concentric circles, which I encourage you to do if you buy the book. But all that simply says is that all of us are complex people. Therefore, one of the ways in which we know racism operates is it closes down complexity. So when we see, for example, an asylum seeker, we assume that they're just one simple narrative. They are complex people like all of us. And the more complex we acknowledge people are, the less we are likely to use stereotypes. So that's the first thing. Second thing then, very quickly, is when we are doing our collective way of being church or any community, is to have what we often say liberation theology is a hermeneutic of suspicion. That's just a fancy word for asking the why question. Why are we doing it like this? And who benefits and who doesn't benefit from how we do this? Just one very quick example. In most churches I've been in I've been in church all my life. We do meetings, let's say 7:30 on the evening, because we assume everyone works from 9 to 5 in a professional job. They go home, they have enough time to put the kids to bed and blah, 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 have dinner, and then go back out again for a 7:30 meeting. And our meeting assumes that most people are literate, articulate, and can think on their feet as we go through a linear, sequential agenda from number 1 with who's here and matters arising through to number 10. It's interesting how we know that there are learning styles, different learning styles in our communities, and yet we still operate as if everybody has a particular learning style that says, okay, so let's discuss mission as number 4. and we'll discuss it for 5-10 minutes, because obviously, like, we get through the whole agenda. We'll discuss it long enough, and of course, all the people can think quickly and can say stuff straight off there, say that bit. Then we make a decision, then we move on. Those people who think slower, or people who need to process stuff, who maybe an hour later may say, Matt, I've got a really fantastic idea for mission. Oh, no, sorry, like, we passed that an hour ago. We're now on number 7. We can't go back. So why can't we go back? Where is it written? Is it somewhere in the Apocrypha that says, actually, once we've discussed it, like, we can't go back? What would happen if we had agendas that were circular? And so you did something, you made a provisional decision, you went and then you came back to it. And just to take seriously the fact that people process information differently. What would happen if we assumed that, did not assume that our meeting should happen at a set time, but actually that, like, we had meetings at different times because people do shift work and do various other things? Simple questions that just says how we do stuff is never neutral. It will advantage some people and disadvantage others. Therefore, just to ask the why question, why are we doing it like this, and who's advantaged and who isn't, is another way of being serious about inclusivity. And then finally, in terms of, and I guess it's the hardest of all the three, which is like the biggest systemic stuff. And therefore, part of what we have to do, I think, in terms of church, thinking of the exercise of those two sides, is to think about the ways in which there are implications for how we vote and how we engage with the world as people of faith. I had an amazing conversation last year with a guy who, in a local church, does fantastic work with refugees, does a lot of work with refugees. And yet his political views were often on the political right of people who actually demonize all the people that he works with on a local basis. And I said to him, like, have you never seen like the disparity between what you're doing here? And the truth is he hasn't, because he hadn't thought of his faith in a way that was holistic around looking at systems and structures. So, for example, and I'm sure that many of you know this already, the church does great work with food banks. That's one of the distinctive service things that our church has done. But actually, a much bigger, deeper question is, why does the 5th biggest economy in the world need food banks in the first place? And why are we not challenging our communities around saying it's good that we're helping? But why does that help even, why does this even need to exist in the first place? That is a long haul thing, which therefore, and this is profoundly my last word on the subject, is the importance of spirituality. The reason why I remain a Christian theologian, for all my faults, for all my issues with the Christian faith, for all the ways it's colluded with, all the ways it's been racist, all the ways it treated my mum like crap, all the things that could probably tell me that I should leave it. The reason why I don't is because in the end, I believe that God is love, and that in the power of the Spirit, we are empowered to keep on keeping on. Because what we have to realize is that empire, however you describe it, evil, whatever you want to name it, is not going to sue for peace anytime soon. And therefore, what we need as people of faith is that which sustains us for the long haul. Because believe it or not, people did die before George Floyd. And whilst it's good that footballers are taking the knee and everyone seems hyper conscious at the moment, we know that in 3-4 years' time, or maybe even next year, it'll go back to business as usual. And so the question then becomes, how do us who are trying to live into a reality of the kingdom, just keep on keeping on and believing that change will happen, not because human beings have the power to change, although we do, but actually that in the end, a God of righteousness will guide us there. So final words, final words, always go like one of my heroes, Martin Luther King Jr., who says, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it dips towards justice. I misquoted it, by the way, but even so, that's roughly what it means. It's long, but it's always tilting, it's always moving towards justice. We have to have the faith to continue to journey with God in that belief. Thank you very much.
Anthony, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I have learned so much, and I think I echo lots of people's. I'm going to speak for them, you know, not to them. I will take this moment of power I have as host and abuse it by saying, thank you so much. Seriously, it like we said, it flew, and it really did. It would be great if sometime in the new year we might pick up some of these things with both you and Richard again. I think that would be really valuable, because I think we were getting to the end of where we are now, in the fact of how we keep on keeping on. And that's the reality. You know, we know food banks are just a plaster, but how do we then do the bit that underpins change? And so that would be a fascinating discussion to have sometime in the new year. But again, thanks to you, to Delene, to Richard, for all taking part in this. I will put this up, if it's all right with everybody, on our YouTube channel, so that the people who couldn't be here tonight can still watch it, and indeed I can watch it, because there was lots I'd love to kind of get a settled understanding of, rather than but the issue of kind of sameness and all of that is really fascinating. So thank you so much again. We are over time, so we will let Anthony get on, and thank you all for joining in. And if yeah, watch out for it on the YouTube clip. I'll send the link through. So again, thank you so much to everybody, and take care. I was going to say safe journey home, but yeah, you're not. Safe journey off the power button, everybody.
Bye.
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 Take care now.
Thank you for organizing this, Lee and Danny. That was brilliant.
No problem. Anytime. See you all soon.
Thank you.
Bye.